On December 8, 1941, Japan invaded Hong Kong. In less than 3 weeks, the British garrison there, which had been fortified with Canadian troops, was overrun. That fight and the fate of those soldiers as prisoners of war is the subject of a harrowing new book written by the son of a Canadian Forces doctor who lived through it all. It's called The Captain Was a Doctor: The Long War and Uneasy Peace of POW John Reid. And it brings Jonathan Reid to our virtual studio tonight from Riverdale in the provincial capital. And Jonathan, we're so grateful you could spare some time for us tonight. How you doing?
Very well, thank you, Steve, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for saying so. I do want to start by having you take us back to August of 1941, a little over 80 years ago, and your dad is a young Canadian doctor. He volunteers to join the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps. There's his picture. Boy, what a good-looking guy he was. How did he end up being sent to Hong Kong?
At the end of their 5 weeks officer training, the men were offered a chance to take a 2-week tropical medicine course. And my father, of course, was curious. He and a friend, Gordon Gray, opted to do that. And in the meantime, as they were going through that course, in the background were the negotiations between Britain and Canada to send battalions to Hong Kong as reinforcements. And when it came time to choose 2 extra medical men to go with the battalions, the powers that be thought that those men that had just finished a tropical medicine course, and as they were going to semi-tropical Hong Kong, were the ones to pick. So it was Gordon Gray and John Reid.
We have a picture of his unit's arrival in Hong Kong. Sheldon, you want to bring that up and we'll take a look? He arrived just, there it is, 3 weeks before the fateful battle. That is his unit arriving in Hong Kong. Do you think these Canadians understood that they were essentially being sent to a suicide mission?
The vast majority would not have known that. There were a few signs that officers who'd taken the course earlier had been told that Hong Kong was an outpost and would remain an outpost. And the definition of that in military parlance from the British point of view was it was a position that was to be defended, but could not be reinforced, and the men could not be extracted from it. So it was fight to the finish. But the majority did not know that, and they had been led to believe they were going on garrison duty, and they were led to believe that the intelligence reports showed that there was no imminent danger from the Japanese, and that the Japanese forces to the north of Hong Kong were actually quite weak.
Well, that turned out to be clearly untrue. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and overrun. And let's set up this next question by just situating the event. December 8, 1941, it's the day after Pearl Harbor. I guess a hardened Japanese force that had already been fighting the Chinese for 10 years. They attacked the Canadians, and this group had never seen battle before. One Canadian described it as a cauldron of hell. Perhaps you could help us better understand what they were facing at that moment.
Well, to begin with, it was actually simultaneous with the attack on Pearl Harbor because they were across the date line.
Oh, of course.
The forces were arrayed on the mainland to the north of Hong Kong Island, and the rest were on the island. The initial attack by the overwhelming Japanese force, instead of taking a week to beat their way south to the Hong Kong Island, it took about 40 hours. In other words, it was a collapse on the part of the garrison. They were quickly withdrawn onto the island, and starting on December 13th, there was a continual siege of bombardment, artillery, airplane bombing of the island to soften it up. And on December 19th, huge forces attacked across the water to the north shore of the island. What had been seen by the Canadians on arrival was that there really hadn't been preparation for this kind of an assault. There should have been positions on the mountains, which there weren't. And the way Hong Kong Island is topographically laid out, it's full of mountains and canyons, so that there are only certain ways you can make your way forward or backward. The numbers that the Canadians had, along with the others, was about 14,000, and there were well over 40,000, perhaps 50,000 Japanese coming against them. The battle in this very ferocious, scrub-like, mountainous canyons, valleys, hot temperatures. And the thing to remember was that the Canadians had been sent across the Pacific without their third ship, which had 212 vehicles, their armored carriers, their water carriers, their trucks. They lacked mortar ammunition that should have gone with them. So they arrived with a bare cupboard as far as their backup, and they had to borrow things. So the Canadians, in spite of the fact that they were shortchanged in respect to the material they had with them, in the battle, though General Maltby had belittled their training and their capability, the reports showed after the war that the Japanese found the Canadians the toughest to fight, and they had the highest casualties against the Canadians, in spite of the fact that they lacked some of the needs that were left behind.
And do I have this right? Is this the first time in World War II that Canadians would have fought on the ground in battle?
That's correct. The Canadians, the two regiments that went, the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers, were the first to fight. And as it turned out, they would be the last troops to come home in 1945.
Let's do an excerpt from the book here because, well, the Canadians eventually surrendered. Many became prisoners of war, including your father. And here is what it was like inside the camp hospital. Those who couldn't control their body functions had to use the floor. Cakes of excrement and pools of urine lay everywhere. The filth proved a mecca for rats, which were scampering about in large numbers. The next day, the downpour had gotten heavier and never let up. The roof began to leak like a sieve, causing flooding to the depth of 6 to 8 inches. Bricks were brought in to elevate the cots. The rodents, which were swimming around the floating muck, tried to clamber on our beds. Some succeeded and began attacking the flesh of patients, but they didn't feel it. The flesh was dead. Now let's follow up on that with some pictures taken inside one of the, there's one of them right there. This is inside one of the camp huts. And then I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up the next picture. This was the effect of the living conditions that the Canadian prisoners had to endure. And, well, Jonathan, I'll simply ask you, when you see that image, describe the conditions for us that would have led to that.
The excerpt you just read was the makeshift hospital in North Point Camp, which was the first camp the Canadians were sent to in Hong Kong. It was terribly grim. Over the next year, the Canadians were moved to a bigger camp, Sham Shui Po, on the mainland, and the shot you just showed was one of the huts there. And my father said that in their case, if there was a question of a machine or a man, they would say, the man goes, we keep the machine. And obviously we saw the opposite point of view. Over that first year, the caloric intake for the men was probably around 1,000 calories a day. It was a bland food. There was no protein, animal fat, no vitamins consistently. So there was a downgrading, a steady course downgrading of their health. And at the same time, they were suddenly forced with being slave laborers. In Hong Kong, it was to create or to extend an airport, the airport that had been the British airport. So they were used really as almost animals, and it was wearing and tearing. And by the end of the first year, the health of all the men who had lost 1/4 to 1/3 of their weight, they all had sores, they all had diarrhea, malaria, very was rampant with the men. So no one was well. And the Japanese would say, we have to have a certain number of workers per day. And my father and the other medical officers would literally have to decide as they went down the ranks who was not as bad as the others and would have to go out to work. And that first year in August 1942, on top of the diseases they were already struggling with, was an outbreak of diphtheria. And this was a very virulent attack on the Canadians because, though there was a vaccine by this time, many of the troops from eastern Quebec and the prairies had not been vaccinated as young people and therefore were susceptible. And over the next few months, 58 Canadians died of diphtheria. And the reason for this was that the Japanese refused to give antitoxin until the very end. So that this was a loss of life that was unnecessary, and the men had no medicines to fight it.
Ultimately, what was the survival rate among the prisoners of war?
Well, that's a good question. overall, the Canadians in prison camp in Japan, I can be specific about this, 1,185 Canadians were shipped eventually from Hong Kong to Japan to work as slave laborers there. The overall death rate in the Canadian camps in Japan was 16%. In my father's camp, because of the relationships he formed and the protection he was able to give his men by these negotiations was much lower. It was about 4.6%.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I think your dad, when he did get transferred to Japan, was the only officer among the POWs who were in that camp in Japan. What did that mean? And I guess there were, what, maybe 500 in the camp in total. What did that mean in terms of his responsibilities?
Well, he was chosen as the only officer, and they wanted a medical officer. He later said that that was the best choice, both for the men and for the Japanese. He'd had 5 weeks officers training, so he was not a line officer. He had that year in Hong Kong working with his 3 other doctor colleagues under John Crawford, Dr. John Crawford, who was the senior medical officer. I think he'd learned a lot about handling men and handling the Japanese. But still, he was in charge of 500 men. He found himself now in a brand new camp. These men were being sent to the Nippon Koken shipyard, and they were put to work in terrible drudge jobs, working 12 hours a day, 13 days out of 14. He was, I think, aware after some time that the commandant of the camp that they found themselves in was a man that he could start to push in a direction that would help his own men. And it was a process that took months, but he took a position of sort of calm, persistent persuasion, I think trying to appeal to the humane side and to the commonsensical side, the logical side of the commandant. In other words, saying, you want these men to work. For them to be able to work, they have to be reasonably healthy. They need reasonable food, reasonable rest. And even though they were not able to get anything like the food they should have had, he battled to keep as many men back from work on a daily basis as he could. And that was probably the safest way he could protect the men at that point.
Well, here's a quote from one of his fellow prisoners who said he was a medical practitioner who had no medicines, nothing to work with except his own hands, and yet he's treating 100 people a day. How in heaven's name did he do that?
Well, I think it's the magic of a personality and a physician with a patient. One of the men who was with him, Robert Warren, said exactly what you said, really, that he had no medicines. He knew his men were sick. But Warren said, Dr. Reid, Captain Reid, had a way with him. Those were his words. He had a way with him. And even if he had no medicines to give you, you somehow felt you were being treated.
August of 45, of course, there are 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan, and after 3.5 years of imprisonment, the war ends for these prisoners of war, and here is how one of your dad's fellow prisoners described it. Sheldon, if you would, the graphic. It was a fighter, and as it circled high above our camp, we all ran into the compound. 600 men went wild. We could plainly make out the red, white, and blue and the white American star. Overcome with joy, naked figures dressed only in G-strings jumped and sprang around. Men slapped each other, shook hands, and cried. It was true. It was really over. They were God's own angels sent to liberate his people. They meant freedom and happiness. It was a beautiful day, the best day of my life. I was overwhelmed by the sudden release of emotions that had been suppressed for 4 long years. I returned to my hut and cried like a baby without any shame. Others were so hysterical they had to be hospitalized, while others sat motionless, too dazed with happiness to be able to speak. I know at some point you no doubt have wondered what your own father thought in that moment. What have you come up with?
I do have documents, writings of his afterwards. His main concern was not for the men to go hog wild. They suddenly had freedom. They could go out the gates. They were given money. by the Japanese. They were given increased food. His real concern was that there had been rumors that there could be executions, mass executions. There was uncertainty about a nearby military base and what they would do and what the civilians would do because of the bombing that had taken place. I think he was still very much in leadership mode, not celebrating, thinking, okay, what dangers are we still facing and how do we get through this time? And that's what he spent his time doing, persuading the men to take it easy. Sure, have a good time, but don't overdo it. Don't push things, and let's not upset the people around us, and do the best we can to keep a lid on it until the Americans can get to us.
A couple of months later, October 6, 1945, which I gather is 4 years to the day that your father was shipped out, he arrives back in Toronto, comes home to his wife, Jean, but you write he had become a mentally disturbed man. Not surprisingly, this war changed him. How?
That's a really difficult question, Steve. Everyone that had that experience had some effect that was scarring, physically and mentally. I don't think my father realized he was changed immediately. He'd actually written in a letter to my mother from prison camp, "Stay as unchanged for me as I do for you." Well, that was an impossibility. He did re-engage in his medical practice in Toronto. They had 2 children, myself and my older brother, Tony. But he was restless. That was something everyone noticed, his family and his friends. And he'd done a residency in Vancouver just before the war. He decided, because he was invited back to Vancouver to join the clinic, that he was going to do that. And one of his close friends said that Jack said, "I need a fresh start." And off he went. The complication then, that was a good idea, perhaps. The complication was that in a short time he was in Vancouver before his wife and children arrived, was that he met another woman, a younger woman, a nurse. And in whatever state emotionally and mentally he was at that stage, this was a coup de foudre. This was a sudden blossoming of great passion. And something he didn't seem to be able to stop. And when my mother arrived with her sons, this complicated life began. My father's persuasive charms, which had worked so well, dealing with the commandant, for instance, in the prison camp, somehow turned and were played on my mother and the other woman, so that over about 6 years, my father eventually was running 2 households. He had 2 families in 2 different places in the same city. And he got through this because he was saying to my mother, "I am mentally ill, I want you to stick by me." And yet he couldn't seem to break the other relationship. And he finally was unable to make a decision. It was my mother's decision 6 years later that she couldn't, in spite of all of her love for him and her wish to help him, stick it any longer. And she was the one who withdrew and came back to Toronto.
Let's bring up a picture of your dad and your brother and you. And, you know, so many guys came home from the war and either told their kids whatever their kids asked about or told them nothing because they just really couldn't talk about it. Where was your dad on that continuum?
The second, the latter. Our times together were brief, a couple of weeks in the summer, over 10 years. That was the only time we saw him. They were fun times. We were doing canoeing and all the things you do in the summertime. He loved to chop wood, so we'd be sawing and chopping wood. Over the years that we were growing up, he just never could open up and really discuss with us what had happened to him, what he thought had happened to him, why he'd acted the way he had with respect to our families. So it was a blank wall, except for this very friendly, charismatic father. And then at a certain stage, my brother and I are doing other things. We stopped seeing him in the summer. And really our relationship then was at a distance, as it had always been, and only by letters. And I only saw him 3 times from the age of 15 and until his death.
How tragic is that for you?
My father was a hero. I grew up knowing that. My mother always told us the marvelous things he'd done during the war. She never said a cruel or angry thing about him. So I was able always to create the father I wanted as I grew up. Later, it was difficult, and as a young man, I did try to bring some of this to the surface. And really, he was helpless. He was emotional. He wept, but he couldn't really come up with answers to the big questions that a son would have. Only at the very end, when he was very ill after getting encephalitis and being ill for 4 or 5 years, that seemed to change his persona. And the last time I saw him, he was more open with me and wishing to tell me more than I'd ever seen him. So it was a very happy last meeting.
Sheldon, let's show one more picture here. Let's bring up this picture. Masao Uemori, a former Japanese prisoner of war camp commandant. Your dad saved his life. And that, you might think, would be a very unusual thing to do for somebody who might have been responsible for so much misery for your dad and his colleagues. Why did he do it?
Because Commandant Uemori did bend to my father's will. He did help him, and by the end of their association was helping my father in every way he could. At the end of the war, my father knew he might become charged with war criminal crimes. He decided to write an affidavit right after the war and several letters to prevent that happening. He learned a year later that Uemori was being charged, and he wrote a very, very serious affidavit, which was sent during trial. He felt fairness had to stand, and that this man had done the best he could under the circumstances as a Japanese commandant to help him with making his men have an easier time of it. He would not let him go into prison when he'd done such a good job. As he said, there are no other commandants I met when I was in the Army who would have bent to my will as Uemori did.
Jonathan, this is one heck of a book. The Captain Was a Doctor, The Long War and Uneasy Peace of POW John Reid. It has brought Jonathan Reid, his son, to our virtual studio tonight from Riverdale in downtown Toronto. We thank you very much for telling us your dad's story on TVO tonight, and wish you well going forward.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.